Just a little bit about GLS before we get into the pallet equation. So GLS is part of the Lehman Group of companies, which is now part of the Super Group of companies. And there's a very deliberate strategy around the structure of the organization that can be best illustrated through one of the solutions that we provide to customers. So Lehman Logistics provides the secondary distribution link from the retail DCs to the retail stores, ensuring the quickest turnaround time on trucks, the biggest vehicle fill rates, as well as the lowest unit cost of transportation. RSC is a functional labor outsource company that provides DC picking operations to big retailers like Pick and Pay and ShopRite. And their whole purpose is to ensure that we're picking at the fastest rate and ensuring the biggest vehicle fill within the truck environment. And last but not least is that on the return leg from the stores, which is again facilitated by Lehman Logistics, GLS is the asset management equipment pooling piece, where we ensure that every piece of equipment that we ship to stores is effectively recovered, returned, repaired, inspected, and then reissued back to customers. The case for plastic pallets, well, my challenge today is really to see if I can convince you if there is a case for plastic pallets within the South African market. It's a bit like trying to convince a meat eater to become a vegan, so it's not an easy challenge, but I'll do the best I can. If we have a look at the value chain across a number of the different nodes in the supply chain, we see a gradual shift away from traditional material types to more plastic. So, for example, in the agriculture industry, there's definitely a big shift away from wood to plastic returnable bulk bins, despite the fact that the price differential is normally 3 or 4 times more expensive. Within the harvesting, processing, and the distribution elements of the fresh markets, most of the retailers are effectively geared around a plastic crate or plastic returnable crate. There's still an element of cardboard coming to the supply chain, but 90% of that volume is effectively distributed in plastic crates. Within your first mile, mid-mile, and last mile solutions, a lot of the materials are slowly migrating away from single-use plastic, single corrugated package use, or wooden pallets or pool pallets, to more returnable plastic pallets. And then last but not least is particularly within the air freight space, is a lot of that is actually migrating to lightweight, nestable pallet solutions away from disposable wood. In terms of the benefits or the pros and cons of plastic over timber, timber pallets are repairable. I mean, that's a given. Any broken pallet can be repaired. The problem is that repair cost requires infrastructure to support. It's a low acquisition cost. I mean, a wooden pallet in South Africa, depending on the quality and the grade of the wood, is anywhere between 220 and 300 rand a pallet. You get approximately 12 trips out of a pool pallet before you effectively have to replace the pallet wholly. So every time you repair a pallet, you're introducing new elements or new timber into the pallet. After 12 trips, you've effectively rebuilt that entire pallet from scratch. It's a higher total life cycle cost. In other words, the cost of the pallet over its life cycle on a unit cost strip basis is significantly higher than plastic. There's a lower product protection. Wooden pallets, by nature and by definition, contain a lot of contaminants, nail splinters, broken boards that can actually damage the product irreparably. There's a high maintenance cost. You need a lot of infrastructure. It's capital intensive. And then it's a higher CO2 footprint because every wooden pallet that requires to be repaired has to be shifted from one location to another, undergo the repair process, and then be shipped back into the customer environment. If we look at the other side of the equation, plastic pallets are 100% recyclable. So you can take this plastic pallet, for example, and we can turn it into totes. Or we can take the totes and we can turn them back into plastic pallets. You can't do that with wood. In terms of the acquisition cost, it is a lot higher, but the life expectancy and the lifespan of a plastic pallet is about 30 or 40 times longer. In terms of the number of trips on a pool pallet, for example, the pallet that we see here, we estimate that you could potentially get 250 trips in its life cycle, but you'd effectively have to replace a pallet. To put that into context, a pallet does on average in South Africa about 4 trips a year. So over the life cycle of a a plastic pallet, you could get 30 years of useful life out of a plastic pallet compared to 3 years out of a wooden pallet. It's a lower total unit cost. It's a higher product protection because they're uniform in design. They're structurally integral, and they've also got clean hygienic surfaces. There's a lower contamination rate or risk to products, and there's no maintenance cost. Effectively, this is the one beautiful thing about plastic pallets. You can repair them, so you can plastic weld, but every broken pallet can effectively be chipped, granulated, put back into the production cycle, and you can produce the same pallet again. And last but not least, it's a lower CO2 footprint. Because you're recycling the material on a continuous basis, you're not effectively losing or wasting any of the material. And also by the fact that you're not repairing the pallets, you're eliminating 2 transportation legs in the repair process. A wooden pallet you have to take from a retailer DC, for example, back to a repair plant, and then from the repair plant to the customer, With a plastic pallet, you can effectively issue the same pallet back to the inbound supply customer. So as the suppliers are coming in with their inbounds, they're taking away the equipment on the outbound, and you're effectively saving on the CO2. The one thing I love about plastic pallets, and I'm agnostic material, so I'm not pro-plastic, I'm not pro-wood. I'm just saying is that if we have a look at in terms of where the future of the supply chain is going, you can embed a hell of a lot of technology into a plastic pallet that can tell you a hell of a lot about your product. It can tell you where the product is, it can tell you the temperature where it is, it can tell you how long the product's been sitting in a location, it can tell you whether the pallet has been impacted or not by a forklift, it can tell you the life cycle in terms of actually the product, when it entered the warehouse, how long it's been sitting in a rack, and then when it needs to be disposed of. So there's a huge amount of sort of intangible benefits that are attached to plastic pallets that are very difficult to replicate or integrate into a wooden pallet. In terms of plastic pooling companies around the world, I mean, the litmus test is always, is it gaining traction around the world? And there's a couple of examples where it is. So if we look at the US market, for example, there's some really big plastic poolers already in play. And they've already seen the opportunity in terms of where wood's headed from a sort of a supply point of view, as well as from a cost point of view, and they're capitalizing on that opportunity to integrate them into supply chains, which will eventually displace the wood and make them market leaders. Within the European market, we've also got quite a good few players. I mean, Task is becoming a somewhat dominant player around the world. And the nice thing about the European ones is that they're also pretty technology friendly. So if we look at Svenska, for example, and NLP in Norway, they've integrated a lot of technology into the equipment to effectively help them manage their businesses, and their pools a lot more efficiently and at a much lower cost than you, for example, with wood. Within the sort of Asian markets, I mean, every single one of these pooling operators have effectively embedded technology as a standard service offering. So every single one of these pallets can be tracked remotely. I mean, JPR, for example, Japan pallet rental company, I think in the last 10 years has lost 0.02% of the pallets because they put the infrastructure in place in the supply chain to track every single pallet movement across Japan. So they know where every single one of their assets are at any given time. Africa, we're a little bit behind the curve at the moment. I think the only plastic pallet pooler that I'm consciously aware of is SmartLoad, and I think they're in the room today. And they're primarily focused on the first mile solutions, so displacing ingredient supply from wood and then returning it onto plastic pallets. But there's a huge amount of scope within Africa to displace wood. Now the question at the end of the day is a market like South Africa, which is on a par with Europe and America from a sort of a supply chain sophistication point of view, ready for plastic. If we have a look at the South African retail market, it's broken down into two distinct channels. You've got your formal channel, which is your Pick and Pays, your ShopRites, your Checkers, your Woolies, and your Walmarts. And then you've got the informal channel, which is your traditional wholesalers, the Spazas, and effectively the sort of the remote regional independent retailers. If we have a look at the total consumption of food and products in the FMCG segment, the formal trade accounts for 70% of that volume. So 30% is only going to traditional, and 70% is concentrated in the hands of effectively 5 retailers. So the underlying business concepts for plastic is actually good. If you've got 70% of the volume being concentrated in 5 players, then fundamentally plastic is good for South Africa. The next challenge is we have to look at the South African pooling market and say, well, is the business model from a pooling perspective conducive to supporting plastic pallets? Within South Africa, you have 4 distinct business models within the pooling space. You have basically what they call the transfer hire model, which is where if I'm a supplier supplying into a retailer like Pick and Pay, I would transfer the liability and the cost of the asset from my account to the Pick and Pay account, and Pick and Pay in turn would be responsible for the asset within the supply chain until it comes back to me. Then you have the exchange model, which is effectively the model that's in play within the sort of the informal segment. Whereas if I'm the customer with a pallet account, and if I leave pallets in the market, that liability and that cost of the pallet is still on my account until such time as I can recover the pallet, bring it back, and then effectively either return it or reuse it. The third model, which is actually quite a new model for South Africa, is called a cooperative trade. So in other words, it's what we call an MPD. That effectively means that if I send the pallet into the informal channel or non-participating retailers or retailers that don't want to take responsibility to transfer hire, that risk of that pallet sits with the pooler. So if I was a pooler, for example, I'm obligated and responsible for ensuring that that pallet is collected, recovered, and it's at my cost if I don't. But that comes obviously at a price because I'm assuming the risk. So the cost that you pay for that particular model is significantly higher than you would, for example, with the transfer hire model. And then the last model is effectively what they call the one-way trip or out-of-pool movement. If I ship a pallet, for example, from here to Congo, that pallet's never going to come back again. It's effectively deemed as lost, and the compensation is charged, and I'm responsible for the replacement fee. If we have a look at CHEP South Africa, which is really the only sort of dominant pallet pooler in play, it's quite an infrastructure-heavy operation. They've got 64 service centers around the country, which is quite extensive for a country this size if you look at it in comparison to Europe. The other thing as well is that they require a pool of about 6 million pallets to service the entire market. So there's quite a substantial number to displace. So to displace 6 million pallets of wood and replace it with 6 million plastic pallets is a massive undertaking. That will take a huge amount of time. I think from a production point of view, I think a really seasoned, high-quality plastic manufacturer can produce 1,000 pallets a day. So it'll take a number of years before you've effectively made any dent in terms of actually displacing wood. And then the third thing is that the one thing that's also in our favor in South Africa is that principally most of the market is geared around a single platform type. So there are 4 different or 5 different pallet sizes in South Africa, but one pallet is effectively 95% of that pool. And that's basically what they call the Code 1. Interestingly enough now, there's a plastic pallet trial that's going on in America. So again, it's been run by CHEP. So the question from the retailer was that because of all the inherent problems that we've incurred with wood, splinters, nails, contamination to the product, health and safety issues in the rack environment, and also in the operation, they've asked CHEP to effectively pilot a plastic pallet to see whether it's economically viable for one, commercially sustainable for CHEP. Obviously, they've got to make money, otherwise it doesn't make sense. And then the last piece, does it actually bring a lower cost to the supply chain and to their suppliers? By their own admission, which I think was quite interesting, is that they said by taking away wood and replacing it with plastic, they would eliminate 75% of the return legs from retail DC back to service center. So by their own implication, they're saying is that if we change from wood to plastic, 75% of all the pallets that are coming into retail supply chain can go directly back to the customers without the need for CHEP to inspect it or repair it. So the question for us is that if you're eliminating 75% of your return legs from a DC to a plant, what does that look like from a plant infrastructure point of view? Out of the 64 plants that are in South Africa, would we see a massive reduction in that infrastructure, and what's the implication from an OpEx point of view? Just from a very simplistic, and again, this is really simple. I mean, it's quite a complex business. There's a lot of variables in play. But let's just assume, for argument's sake, that the wooden pallet today in South Africa is costing you 300 Rand. And the plastic pallet over here, for example, is costing you 1,200 Rand. We know that you're only going to get an average of about 12 trips out of a wooden pallet, but you effectively have to replace the entire pallet with either new material or effectively replace it with a brand new pallet. On the inverse side, we've got the plastic pallet, which we've seen before is basically 250 plus trips, but let's just say for argument's sake that it's only going to give you 120 trips before you have to replace it. On a straight line calculation, the cost per trip of wood versus plastic is 2 times the price, or 2.5 times the price. So automatically, it's basically implying that because we're getting a much longer life cycle out of the pallet, there's less OpEx, despite the fact that the CapEx is 3 or 4 times higher, the average cost per trip that a user is likely to pay is going to be 2.5 times less. The other benefits as well is that you don't need infrastructure to support a plastic pallet. You can embed technology, so from an asset management and also from a product tracking point of view, there's a huge amount of intangible and soft benefits. And then lastly, it's completely recyclable. I think this is a bit of a challenge for the South African market because pallet pooling essentially has been privately owned for so long. Is a country like South Africa with a very strong and dominant retail base that's concentrated in the hands of 5 retailers, supported by a multitude number of sort of well-established FMCG brands like Unilever, Procter & Gamble, SAB, etc., would it make sense for a country like South Africa to have an industry-owned pool, but independently managed by a third party like GLS? So if we have a look at it in Sweden, for example, Sweden's entire pooling market is owned by the industry. So the retailers own the pool and the suppliers own the pool. That entire business is effectively managed by an independent company that's appointed by the industry to effectively manage the pool. It's a $75 million business. The pool size is about 30 million units. So there's 30 million crates and about 3 or 4 million pallets. That entire operation is managed off 4 sites and 171 employees. If we have a look at South Africa by sort of implication, it's a couple of thousand people supported through 64 service centers. So just from a pure theoretical and a hypothetical point of view, it is possible to run a pallet pool in South Africa on plastic with a much lower cost of infrastructure that brings a much lower unit cost to the suppliers. From a material life cycle point of view, we know that plastic is an all derivative, but the nice thing about this, as I said earlier, is that you can literally turn any one of these products into each other. So if there's a surplus of plastic pallets and you want to convert that into totes, for example, you can convert the plastic pallet into totes and vice versa. The other benefit now as well is that the technology is advanced so far now is that there's companies like Repol, for example, that can take post-consumer commingled waste. In other words, they can effectively dig up a landfill and they can turn it into a pallet without any segregation or separation of waste. So they can take organic waste as well as non-organic waste, and under thermofusion heating, they can basically form a pallet. If you have a look at in terms of wooden side point of view, it's a highly capital-intensive operation from the moment you plant the first tree to the moment you effectively harvest and process it. On average, it takes you about 22 years to basically harvest a tree that's sufficiently big enough to produce pallets, and then a very efficient sawmill will only basically produce 6 pallets per tree. So you have to wait 22 years in effect to generate your first pallet. From an impact perspective, they're a classic example in terms of where the world's heading. So they're turning a lot of the post-consumer waste into reused products. And then basically just piggybacking off that, we spoke about Capco earlier today, is that they saw the opportunity for recycled plastics about 40 years ago. And as a result of that, they're now the world's largest plastic pallet manufacturer that's making purely 100% out of recycled waste.
I meant with your future, your life.
Well, that's a little hard to say.
Ben.
Excuse me. Mr. McGuire.
Ben.
Mr. McGuire.
Come with me for a minute. I want to talk to you. Excuse us, Joanne.
Of course.
Thank you.
Oh, he is such
It's just
a
incredible. I
friend.
look at him and I can't believe it.
I
simply can't believe it.
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
Exactly how do you mean?
There's a great future in plastics. Think about it. Will you think about it?
Yes, I will.
Enough said. That's a deal.
Here he is now.
On that note, thanks very much.